The New Mexican is completing 175 years of operating as a locally owned and independent newspaper. Our owner is Robin Martin, and she also is the owner of the Taos News, where her daughter, Laura Baseman Martin, hosts and produces Voices of Taos, the podcast featuring voices of the Taos community. This year, Laura also featured a voice from Santa Fe, Robert Nott, former New Mexican reporter who was instrumental in documenting the 175 years of our newspaper's history. To end the year celebrating the New Mexicans' survival in what has become an increasingly tough business, we are sharing Laura's podcast with you now, her interview with Robert Nott on what it was like to document 175 years of newspaper history.
Welcome to Voices of Taos. My name is Laura Martin Baseman, and I'm the producer of this podcast from the Taos News. Every week, we will be bringing you a voice from our Taos community. This week on Voices of Taos, we're doing something a little bit different. Our sister paper, the Santa Fe New Mexican, is celebrating its 175th year this November. And to talk to us about it, we have Robert Nott, who's currently the Director of Communications for the New Mexico Department of Health. And before that, he worked for the Santa Fe New Mexican for over 25 years, reporting from many different beats. And he also did a lot of the research for our special edition of the 175 years. So welcome, Robert.
Yeah, you should have told them the truth. I was with the New Mexican for 175 years. That's how easy it was for me to research this piece. It's really great to be on your show. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah. So, Robert, tell me a little bit about how you fell in love with reporting and being a journalist.
I was always a writer. Even as a little kid, I loved to write and draw pictures. And I sort of knew one day I'd be a writer. And after I came out here in 92 from New York, I sort of stumbled into a job as administrative assistant in the newsroom and worked for both your grandfather and, your mom, as well as sort of a social secretary, chauffeur, and everything. And a former editor of the Pasatiempo, Denise Cusel, took a chance on me and let me write a theater review in the spring of 93 for My Fair Lady. It was being done at La Casa Sena. They used to do live dinner theater, and it worked out fine. And the next thing I know, I was assigned a lot of stories, and I sort of stumbled into it. In fact, I think she thought I was somebody else when I came in. I think she mistook me for another reporter who was actually applying for a job in the days before the internet when you couldn't check sources. So I hung on, and I was a freelancer for years, and then I formally joined in 99. So yeah, about 28 years in all.
Great. Well, I know that we've been really grateful for all of your reporting in all the different fields. It's been wonderful to have you, and we hope that you're enjoying your new job at the Director of Communications.
I am. It's a whole different world. It's the other side, as they say, but it's really a great group of people trying to do some good, and I picked the right state agency to go to work for. I'm quite enjoying it, so thank you.
Oh, good. Excellent. Well, so into the weeds. So there's a little bit of hysterical drama about the actual day the Santa Fe New Mexican had its first publication date. Would you like to talk about it?
Yeah, that was around the time I was born, 1849. And we've reported separately, as of others, that our first issue was November 24th or November 28th of 1849. Which was it? The archives tell us that it was a Wednesday. In fact, the first couple of editors said, on this Wednesday. And so it made sense that it was the earlier date, even though the paper said November 28th. What happened was probably they printed the front page with the wrong date, but didn't want to pay for the ink and the paper to reprint it. So they put the right date on the inside. So it's led to a lot of confusion. Was it November 24th or November 28th? And it was the Wednesday actually when it published. So that's really the story. The earlier date is the accurate date, even though it had the wrong date on it.
That's fascinating. A really funny thing just for talking about family businesses. So my mother is the second generation to be owner of the New Mexican. And we found out just this year that my parents' wedding anniversary is also on November 24th, which is hysterical. And we didn't really realize that until the 175th anniversary, even though we've been celebrating it for a long time. So they just had their 40th anniversary on the same day that the New Mexican had its 175th anniversary. So wonderful. So what are some of the interesting things that you learned in your research about the New Mexican?
The funnest part was going over to the New Mexico History Museum's archives, which are right around the corner from where the New Mexican now is here on Washington. And the librarian there, the head librarian, Heather, was fantastic at, pulling out all these bound copies of the New Mexican. You were almost afraid to turn the pages for fear they would crumble. The words of history would crumble in your fingers, and I wore, they made me wear gloves. And it was just kind of wonderful to randomly turn the pages and see famous names that mean a lot to us today. Kit Carson comes to mind, of course. Bronson Cutting, one of our former owners, a state senator. People like that, to see the wars unfold and the Spanish flu envelop us, not unlike COVID a few years ago. And yet to find these grisly, gruesome, absolutely fascinating tales of horror and crime, coming across an axe murderer who cut a lady's head off across the street from the Capitol over there by Don Gaspar, and she was a fortune teller. But wait, another fortune teller claimed she wrote the police a letter that the ghost of the first fortune teller who had her head cut up came to her in a dream to reveal who the murderer was. And what does the New Mexican do about it? Nothing.
Yes.
There's no follow-up story. You're going through page after page after page. And they wonder today about those crime stories or whatever happened to that guy that got away, right? So it was little things like that. And there were little scandals and fun little comments about hogs in the streets and flooding, waters, rivers, rain, many of the same things we fight today, the environment, the war over the environment, the lands, trying to put, power plants in to help bring us electricity. It was really watching the growth of the city and to a larger degree, the West, through the pages of these newspapers dating back to 1849.
Mm-hmm. And I think the New Mexican kind of got to witness a lot of big changes in New Mexico because 1849, we were a part of the U.S., right?
Yes, we were. It was, how many years before statehood? 53, 52. So we were a territory, and there was early talk, like 1850, about becoming a state. And there was push efforts to make us a state, but it took a long time. But yeah, we caught the West. We caught the unfortunate, long walk of the Navajos. We caught Kit Carson rounding them up. We caught depravities, and we caught, racism and, fights on the plaza. And everything was there. When there was something that suddenly didn't appear, like the atomic bomb, we knew it was happening. The newspaper knew it was happening, but there's nothing for years about what's happening in Los Alamos. So that's really interesting too, the omissions of history. But World War I, World War II, the Bataan March, it's all there. And the Depression, the stock market, all of it seen through the eyes of the Santa Fe New Mexican. Often we would use Associated Press wire pieces for some of those stories, but a lot of times our reporters would actually cover them. And it was just really interesting to read the copy, how they jumped right into the story with like this, exploitative lead. And a lot of that still exists in newspaper writing today. But yeah, the history of the state, the history of the city, all told on the pages of the Santa Fe New Mexican, which was both a weekly and a daily, and sometimes the two overlapped.
Interesting. So that means that there was just a weekly edition that would kind of conglomerate all of the news for the previous week. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. In both 4 pages in English and 4 in Spanish.
Okay.
Which was wonderful.
HomeWise is a local New Mexico nonprofit committed to increasing the availability of affordable homes for working people in Santa Fe. Our HomeWise Homes communities provide quality-built, energy-efficient homes with up to 40% of the houses reserved for modest-income buyers. Our newest community, Miraflores, offers single-family homes with spacious backyards, a family-friendly environment, and convenient access to the Tierra Contenta Trail Network. Standard features include low-E vinyl windows, stainless steel appliances, granite kitchen countertops, a tankless water heater, and more. Contact us today to learn more about Miraflores. Call 505-983-9473 or visit us at homewise.org. Equal Housing Lender, NMLS number 188231.
Talking about history of the New Mexican, you got to see a lot of changes in the news industry with your time as a reporter.
We were still doing cut and paste down there, and I don't even think you were born, Laura, and maybe you were 3 or 4.
I'm 30. I'm 37 today.
Yeah,
So
okay.
yeah,
You were
so
around,
I was
but,
around. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, there were people like Jimmy cutting and pasting the actual type onto the pages then, long before computers. It was like word processors that we worked on, and it was beyond the days of the typewriter when I came in, although there were still a few typewriters around the newsroom. And you could still smell the scent of smoke in the air from just a couple of years before when they were smoking. By that time, 92, 93, they had stopped that. You know, there were certain jokes that certain reporters still had flasks of whiskey in their top drawer. I'm not going to confirm or deny any of that. But it was still, there was a hint of the old school still there in the 90s. And certainly by 2000, you know, that was it. Technology moved in, and the way we created and distributed our work changed. One of the stories we have in the 175th is print versus digital, you know, and how that conflict is still there as people have a difficult time, as readers, wanting to give up the print thing that they want to hold in their hands in the morning. I just read the New Mexican at my kitchen table before I came down here. I also have the digital subscription. And then B, I'm guessing here, but I'm thinking some advertisers are still slow to jump digitally. They're saying, we don't know that it can pay off as well, you know. So, and your mom talks a little bit about that in the story I wrote for the special section on that conflict, that divide.
Yeah, as a millennial who's going to be in the 3rd generation of the newspaper family, I prefer reading things digitally, but at the same time, there is something nice about a printed product. I especially like the way that with her fancy German press that the images are done on, even on newsprint. It's a different way of engaging with a story or with images from our community, especially when something happens. I was at the New Mexican printing plant 2 weeks ago, and it's interesting to see the editions that they have highlighted throughout the years. And there's a couple of them. There's a couple of when my grandfather sold New Mexican to Gannett and him suing back for the paper in 87, which was the year I was born. And then there's some special editions for the wars and also one for 9/11 too. That was the last edition that I remember being an extra print.
I wrote a story for that. I had friends in New York City, and Rob Dean, the editor at the time, a wonderful man who's since passed on, he came to me and said, can you get people on the phone? And I had a friend working in the Pentagon, so I made those calls and we threw that thing together. It came out about 2:30 in the afternoon.
Yeah.
And it was a fantastic extra on a very unfortunate event.
It was. It just goes to show that sometimes having a local paper and having the perspective of the local paper of a national tragedy or a national event is really important. And I think it helps people who are in their community make sense of what's happening often.
And it's doable. You can do it with local journalists. They can get on the phone. They can get people on the East Coast. They can cover international and national events. But it's all the years, too, that I worked here, and I'm positive you and your mom know this, there was that other side, those people that are like, we get it, but we want to know about the shooting that happened down in the southern part of Cerrillos Road, or hey, what about that fire, just downtown in one of the hotels? They still want that, what is that activity? And if a plane flew overhead repeatedly, that still happens today. They're calling the newsroom. What's the plane? What's going on? Is it black ops? Is it the military? Strange lights in the sky. We used to get those UFO calls at like 9 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
I've got video. We want to. So it's interesting how much they love that what's happening now, just like they did in 1849 with our first issue.
Yeah, the hyper local information. Well, that's a thing that we can provide that, and we're a respected source, that we can usually follow up on that stuff. What do you think about just the future of journalism now with social media and there being so much information on the internet?
What you have erupting are what I call citizen journalists, and they can often be incredibly helpful to a professional journalist when they do the public records request and say, look what I found. And they can also be sort of have a point of view that's not at all balanced or fair. It's very much anti this entity or anti that entity. And, they have their own agenda. And they may still do really good public records work in terms of the documents they provide. So I think it's just added to the cacophony of voices that could be mistaken for real journalism. And it can muddy the waters a lot in terms of what's really respected and accurate. And it takes, a really observant reader to say, okay, I got it. The New Mexican, it may have its flaws and its problems. I may not like that writer, but this one over here is great. In general, we do a really good job in all the years I was here of really trying to balance out the two sides, tell the truth, get to the bottom of it. Sometimes we failed and sometimes we succeeded. And those other voices can really cloud that when people say, is that a real journalist? Or I'd rather pay attention to this guy or gal who maybe is not nearly as accurate and not as neutral.
Absolutely. I think one of the locations where we get a lot of drama in the community and a lot of curiosity and a lot of opinions is around the national labs. And you kind of mentioned that there was a gap in talking about what was happening in Los Alamos, the 30s and 40s.
It looks like the local media, and I don't think the New Mexican was alone, probably had a tacit agreement that we're not going to say there's just something going on up the hill. And, suddenly they reported as if, hey, guess what was in our backyard? There's a really funny little story, A surprise, we woke up this morning to discover that the Manhattan Project was right up the hill. Nobody knew. Well, a lot of people knew, and I suspect people in the news industry knew. In the days when journalists would sometimes keep national security events out of the public's eye, like they would shield a celebrity and not talk about their sex scandals or something, I just got thinking of something, Laura. I often think some readers expect journalists to be judges. We really can't be. We can't even be members of the jury. We can't be the district attorney or the prosecuting attorney or the sheriff with the summons. That's not our job.
Totally.
And I once wrote about a couple of folks tied to a private education facility, which I won't mention, who maybe pulled off some questionable things, and they disappeared and they got away. And a reporter from Colorado called me or said, hey, what do you know? What happened to these folks? And I said, sometimes the bad guys get away. Even the journalists can't lasso them. That shouldn't be our job.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that's what our editorial page is for, too.
Yeah.
That we are able to separate out those kind of more long perspective or judgments on what's happening in the community. And we try to do that unbiasedly as much as can, because we're trying to look at multiple sides of facts. We try and take the information that's gathered from the journalists in the community and then be like, oh, hey, how do we think that the local government should vote on this upcoming issue? How do we think that this local official should be handling this issue? I think it's a different way of doing that kind of judge position, but with a knowledge that it's just an opinion, and we section it off from the rest of the journalism in the paper.
And you have a great columnist, in my view, Mylin, who also does the same thing for the paper. It's interesting because people will have a thought about politically, which way does the New Mexican lean? Politically, which way does the Albuquerque Journal lean? Well, we must be to the left and the Journal must be to the right. But often it is the op-ed / editorial board who lean that way, but not necessarily all the reporters in the newsroom. And that's been really interesting to find out that, in fact, reporters of all political types and persuasions have worked in this newsroom and still do. And looking back at the history in my research, it was interesting, too, to see that the New Mexican was basically considered a Republican newspaper for the first 100 years, 1849 to 1949. Your grandfather bought it, and it slowly began moving to the left. But there's some pretty funny anti-democratic op-eds and stories in the New Mexican of the 1800s. One I remember saying that thankfully the citizens of the state hired all Republicans to be treasurers in all the counties because it's well known that no Democrat could be trusted with our state money. I mean, that's just the sort of writing they would have.
Totally.
Today it's very amusing. I'm sure at the time it wasn't.
But that's a huge switch that the country itself has had, too. Democrats back in the day were, especially around the Civil War, were the supporters of slavery and had a very different view on social justice than current Democrats do. So must have been interesting to watch that transition as well.
It was really interesting to watch that all play out. I just thought of another tidbit. There's just these historical tidbits. It's like 5 days after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, we get the news on the stagecoach. The stagecoach pulled in this morning with the unfortunate news that Abraham Lincoln has been assassinated. I'm making up the date, but it was about 5 days after.
Right.
And those things happened a lot, like the stagecoach ran late. We don't have news for you today. There'd be a little paragraph. This was before the wire service and everything. The trains came in late, so we're running late tonight with the news. Amazing to think of that's how we got our news back then.
Totally. And do you know where the stagecoaches would originate from?
Well, you mean back east? Often to be like about the Santa Fe Trail sort of thing, from Kansas, mid-country, and then come on out.
Okay.
So there was a lot of that, sorry, we don't have any news. The mail's running late.
Yeah, fascinating. It's funny. So my grandfather, who bought the paper in 1949.
Robert McKinney.
Yeah, Robert McKinney. His grandfather, Robert Moody, who he was named after, was a trader on the Santa Fe Trail, and he was English, which was really interesting. And it's fun to hear my grandfather's kind of interest in Santa Fe kind of being born from stories from his grandfather. And then also his father was an itinerant preacher from Oklahoma. And so he came out to New Mexico when his father was doing ministerial calls around the Southwest and got exposed to it. And he always loved New Mexico. So a kid from Oklahoma who ended up going to school at OU and ended up in Manhattan for a long time and doing well with some stock market things. And he ended up always wanting to own a newspaper, and he came to New Mexico and he made that dream come true when he bought the New Mexican.
He was a fascinating man who used to love to talk history.
Yes.
A real Southern gentleman with a very wry wit. He was he was not unfunny. It wasn't going to be goofy humor, I remember the New Mexican heralded his purchase of the paper by saying he was a rancher from Tucumcari, and there's photos of him with horses, and he kind of looks like he could be a cowboy sort of, but he was really a very fine, well-dressed gentleman, tucks and tails, looked good in suits. I remember driving him sometimes to the opera, and in fact I don't think he liked opera one bit. I think he wanted to be anywhere else but the opera, but it looked good to go to the opera. And sometimes he'd say, Robert, can you pick me up about 90 minutes? I said, well, Mr. McKinney, the opera will only be half over then. He goes, that's why I'm leaving. I want to get out of there before it ends. So he was just a great guy. He also gave me a lot of chances at this paper, and I'm very grateful to him to this day.
He was a character. Both my grandmother was a huge opera lover, and his second wife, Marielle, was a big opera lover. So all of the women in his life, he toterated the opera for very much. So
that's a good verb, tolerated.
Yes.
And one of the stories in the 175th special is about his fight with Gannett.
Totally.
To win the paperback. And he was just steadfast. One man, he had Victor Marshall, an attorney, helping him, but it was really a 1 or 2 man battle against the big corporate interests.
And that was such a unique thing in the 70s and 80s. A lot of papers were selling to these bigger chains, and it was kind of like not very common for a paper to get removed from the chain again. It was kind of like once you're in the chain, you're going to stay there for the rest of eternity. And it's only very recently that some papers are getting sold off by Gannett and Gatehouse and stuff, and they are becoming independent again. So, but could you talk a little bit more about exactly how my grandfather sued for the New Mexican back?
He had a deal that for 5 years he'd still have editorial control. And the big blowout came off over an editorial supporting former Governor Bruce King. And the editors in the newsroom did not do what he wanted. He was back east. And he fought them. He fought the board. And then he decided, I'm going to sue you because you're not doing what I want. Initially, it started off with, you're going to do what I want. Not that he wanted the paperback. And he and his lawyers prepared depositions, court documents, and they saw this clear effort to try to slowly diminish the local voice and the editorial power of Robert McKinney. He was not in good health. He would live on for another 20-some years. They kind of assumed he's not going to fight back, but he did fight back, and it took him years to finally regain editorial control. And then a couple years later, Gannett sort of said, you can have it back, and they gave it to him. And, there's that great photo of him returning to the newsroom and saying, I have returned. And that was just a couple of years before I came on board here. But I think he relished that victory, and it was a very rare victory.
It was. He was very proud of it. And he kept control of the New Mexican up until 2000 actually, when he gave it to my mother finally. He was 90 when he finally let my mother have control over the New Mexican. She was already the owner of the Taos News, which she had been since she was 25, but she wasn't owner of the New Mexican until 2000.
And think about it, for 75 years it's been in your family. That's amazing.
It is, yeah.
Almost half of its total life.
Totally, which is exciting, yeah. And, my brother and I are both active. Elliot is on the board here at the New Mexican, my younger brother, and I'm working weekly at the Taos News, which our listeners of Voices of Taos will know. And I am also on the board of the Taos News, but we're both excited to be active participants in this newspaper. I think the thing for us as a family, which we've really come to realize, and what my grandfather realized in the 80s when Gannett wasn't following through on its deal, is that having local journalism, if it can be supported by local ownership, really helps a lot. And having a family that knows the community, knows the players in the community, also is helpful. So we're pretty passionate about making sure that it stays that way for another generation at least. So
I hope so. I think that's terrific. I mean, we have to remember it's the little small town reporters who are attending the school board meetings, the county commission meetings. They're watching. They're doing their best to watch. They may not always be perfect watchdogs, but they're there. They're not sleeping. They're trying to say, hey, this is happening, and you might want to pay attention to this. And that's something that's often overlooked with small town journalism.
I hope going forward, too, the opportunities that the New Mexican has for doing journalism for the legislative sessions, too, I think that's just going to become even more relevant statewide. I think getting involved in local politics and understanding what your local legislature does is really important. And I think being the state capital paper, the daily paper, is really important and will continue to be important for people around the state. So, and it's cool. There's opportunities such as doing like podcasts. You might not be able to get like a printed product down south, the same day that the session is, but you might be able to do a 5-minute episode about a big thing that happened at the Roundhouse.
And we've always had good state reporters. Daniel Chacon is one of them. Steve Terrell, who was with us for years, is one of them. And we'll just keep building them. I know the paper will just keep building them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, thank you so much, Robert. It was great to have you. Any final thoughts?
No, I just think that it's important to value your local paper. You can be critical of it, of course.
Of course.
And critical of some of the writers. You like some, you don't like some. But really, the New Mexican provides what it provided 175 years ago, a lens in which to look at life in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the surrounding world. It's amazing that a paper like that's done that for 175 years.
Absolutely. And for our Taos listeners, I just want to remind you that you can always pick up a copy of the New Mexican at the Taos News. We have daily editions there. And you can also, there's vendors around Taos as well who have daily editions of the New Mexican. And we also have a beautiful e-edition that you can look at on your iPad or your phone. And I enjoy doing that in bed often in the morning. So, but anyway, it's just because you live in Taos doesn't mean you can't stay informed about some of the statewide happenings and the Santa Fe happenings.
And do we know where people can get a copy of the special section, which came out earlier this month in November?
Well, hopefully people can get copies of that actually at the Taos News as well. So it's a beautiful glossy edition of the 175 years of the New Mexican. We will make sure that there are copies available for people to come and check out at the Taos News.
And don't be afraid to go see if you can get into the New Mexico History Museum archives and browse through some old Santa Fe New Mexicans. It's a fascinating look back at the way we were and what we've become.
I especially love the old advertisements. They're so goofy about hey, you really need this type of tonic, for your horse. Yep. And then 2 pages later, it looks like a very similar tonic for yourself.
Yeah, men's potency, that comes up. Women's hysteria. Yeah. There's a subtext. Some of the ads were quite naughty, and they got away with a lot. I won't stand this too long, but I still remember one from the early 50s with a nude woman.
Oh, my goodness.
From behind. It was advertising a soap.
Oh,
And I
wow.
thought, oh my God, if I was like a little 10-year-old boy, I would really like to keep this page. But it was pretty risque for its time.
That's pretty funny. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Robert. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for Voices of Taos, a podcast by the Taos News, produced by Laura Martin Baseman. Our music was produced and arranged by Miles Bonney, featuring musicians Francisco Velarde, Ruben Hernandez, and Margot Macias. Please join us next week for another episode of Voices of Taos.